everyone. A warm welcome to all of you. It's great to see all of you attending the research seminar series in the Faculty of Forestry today. My name is Tannins. I'm the Associate Dean Research and Innovation in the Faculty of Forestry. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that UBC's Point Grey campus is located in the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. This land has always been a place of learning for the Musqueam people who have passed on their culture, traditions, and history from one generation to another on this site. I would also like to recognize that those who are joining us today using Zoom may have other locations, and I acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. Today, we have a great presentation by Dr. Orlando Rojas. It's my great pleasure to introduce him. Dr. Rojas is a Canada Excellence Research Chair at UBC and the director of the Bioproducts Institute. He received the Anselm Pion Award, the highest recognition in the area of cellulose and renewable materials. He's an elected fellow of the American Chemistry Society, the Finnish Academy of Science and Letters, and the recipient of the TAPI Nanotechnology Award. During his career, Professor Rojas has advised 50 postdocs, 61 PhD, and 50 master's students. He has also hosted more than 100 international visiting scholars. He has more than 35,000 citations with an H index of 85. And he's among the top 1% researcher by citation in his field. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rojas.
Thank you. Thank you, Tannins, for the kind introduction. I'm super happy to be here, and I love it. The energy in the room, a lot of friends, new friends, and some people visiting from other jurisdictions. So very happy to share with you a little bit of our own research work. And let's try to make this a good exchange of ideas. What I will try to do is to share some thoughts about circularity. That is something that is coming very strong in our areas. And for that, I start with this sort of visual, thinking about our environments where we live. And this initially was a picture of my own apartment here in campus, and then a person visualized it in such a way. And my pitch when I joined UBC 3 years ago was that if we go around where we live, we will find many things that can be accessed and produced from biotic materials, from fibers, from plants. And this is a little bit of that idea. I don't go into details, but essentially everything around this room is also possible to make from wood. Of course, this building is very special for that reason. But if you go to other buildings, maybe you have a lot of different fossil-based materials. But that would be the tendency. There is no way back. The question is how to do that transition, especially considering that the available fibers maybe are being reduced as far as the volume that we can harvest from plantations, right? So the objective in our research, that is the same of the Bioproducts Institute that you see in this slide, you can read it, but pretty much relates to valorization of the fiber. In Canada, we have an amazing fiber basket that goes beyond forest fibers, wood, into agricultural fibers and residues, to look into supporting the low carbon economy. And very important, as far as the BPI, the Bioproducts Institute, to accelerate or facilitate investment in innovation to adopt bioproducts and diversify the bioeconomy. So big picture mission, but a very important one, I would say. And this also overlaps with the local BC government idea, the forestry government or forestry ministry. This is a slide from them where you can see more or less the vision, pushing from the bottom up to transition from high volume, low value materials, including energy, biofuels, lumber, to biomaterials. That transition has been very slow, and I think we need to think how to do that. But when you talk to the Canadian forest ministers and chief foresters, they are still in this thinking in the bottom, right? So this hasn't been really well embraced. And there are many reasons for that, right? So of course, there is a justification. But that's what we want to do. So thinking this in the bigger picture, the way I phrase this type of efforts is that we need to have a regenerative biosphere. So we use plants materials that are regenerative by their own very nature, and also to be enmeshed with a circular technosphere, meaning what we do in our industries, in our lives, in the things that we buy and sell. So that's important. And notice here the circularity element. And this is something that I want to bring up in this talk, circularity. For that reason, I use an illustration that was created by Professor Warren Mabee. I changed it a little bit, but I love the idea here to think about time span from 0 to 500 years. The fact that trees capture CO2 from the atmosphere and in a process of biosynthesis, use water and sunlight to produce polysaccharides, lignin, and other molecules. It's a beautiful machinery, a bioprinter for that matter, that is rather slow, but very efficient, especially because the multiple functions that are endowed in every tree that we see around us. And that wood, that plant material can go to construction, and constructions can have a long lifespan. This is great from the point of view of fixing carbon, right? Because that's what we're doing. And that's what we need to promote. And the idea here, you see two circles in brown, is that we can use wood, but that wood can then, at the end of the lifetime, be recirculated as well. There is a lot to be done in that area. We are missing that part. Thinking about urban centers with construction wood, wood from demolition can be actually reutilized. And this is something that we have checked in our group. So circularity is there, and this is a beautiful proposition, using wood to store carbon and use it and recirculate that carbon. This is missing completely in the fossil-based economy that we see today. So big advantage for us working in this area. And a good example is in campus. Of course, you're familiar with this building. At some point, it was the tallest building in the world. Now in Norway, there is a taller building. I don't know, maybe some few meters taller. But this is a good example of this idea of using wood for construction, right? And if you talk to forest ministers, this is priority, timber for construction. And in wood science, that is also a priority given the recent hires, right, that are coming along. But in other areas beyond wood, we have agroforestry and also biomass residues. Very important for us to think about. The circle that you see that is smaller, inserted in the bigger circle, tries to tell that the lifespan of those materials is shorter, but nevertheless can be recirculated. And paper recycling is an example of something that is well advanced. Many countries have a recirculation rate of 70% of paper. That's amazing. And now, you know, in textiles, the same can be said. A lot of efforts in the area of textile recycling. So this is the direction that we need to think. So I put there paper and textile recycling, very important. And then any material that is left that has really less value because of the size and the function, then we can consider this for energy and to produce fibrillated materials. At the end, of course, there will be some losses, some waste material, some purchase, but they will be minimized and they will go to landfill. And luckily, they will be biodegraded and they are also compostable. So when we discuss with plastic people, also with regulatory agencies and politicians, we need to really push this idea. Fibers can be reused to build a net zero economy, and there is no way out. Challenge is to access the fiber. And therefore, I think this is the way that we need to position ourselves. So I will be talking about advancing this technosphere now, because you know very well the regenerative nature of the biosphere. So let me talk about technosphere to make it circular. I will refer to agri-forest biomass and residues, recirculation. I will talk a little bit about paper textiles, and if I have time at the end, talk a lot about pellets, energy, and microfibrillated cellulose. Starting with the first one, of course, now you are well positioned to understand what I will talk. I'm talking about agri-forestry and biomass residues, especially residues. And if we compare the residues that we have around in the Nordic countries, actually it's pretty little that is left in the field. But I have learned from my colleagues in forestry and forest management that in Canada, there is a lot of residues that are underutilized. Huge opportunity for Canada if we figure out how to do it. There are many complications as far as using residues, mainly because location, transportation, access to the material, but I think we need to solve that puzzle, and this is one way. So I will talk a little bit about alternative fibers. And today we have 5 students from North Carolina that are sitting here, that are part of the North Carolina Sustainable Alternative Fibers innovation cluster. And this is a wood department, but they are looking into other alternative fibers, and that includes hemp, sugarcane, wheat straw, miscanthus, many other type of fibers that is accessible in the US. Some of those fibers actually are already in the food that we eat. And here we have reviewed the situation, and in a paper 2 years back, we have discussed the idea of using food losses and waste. As you know, there is a lot of food that is wasted. And it's containing cellulose and lignin, as the table tries to show. Main components are cellulose, lignin, the same that we have in trees, along with maybe other compositions, including proteins and chitin. Of course, here we need to deal with fractionation, recombination, and integration. So there is a lot of processes that go there implicit. It's challenging, but there is no way out. We need to maximize the use of the fibers available. In our research group, these are the fiber feedstocks that we use. As you can see, there are some few trees there, but we go beyond trees. I think we need to consider waste, as I have said before, and for that reason, there are collaborations with different countries like Costa Rica and Mexico to look into residual biomass. In Mexico, for instance, your favorite drink is shown there, right? You can visualize blue agave, huge volume of lignocellulose residues in the production of Primos tequila. In Costa Rica also, we have a student that is looking into pineapple residues, huge biomass volume in one of the largest exporters of pineapple. What to do with that residue that poses an environmental challenge. In India, oil fibers from coconut production, huge economy in some areas in India. Here you can see empty fruit bunches, also lignocellulose, completely underutilized, and many others. Of course, here we're looking into mainly wood and wood residues, right? So let's go a little bit deeper into that. And one case that is relevant to British Columbia is the case of beetle kill pine infestation. Great problem as far as forests or wildfires. It's a major problem. There is a lot of biomass that is in the field that can be used. Of course, there is a problem how to access that fiber. I recognize that, but just a little bit of thinking about the future and what is possible, right? So let's check about the possibility of using beetle kill pine infested wood to produce fibers for advanced materials. So this is more or less well documented in our research and the research of other groups. But I want to say first here that this is a major problem. And what we did here, that was quite a long time ago in the US, was to collect samples from the field. You can see the GPS coordinates there. We look into live trees and those that have been dead for 5 and 8 years. Obviously, those that are dead, maybe they lose timber value, but it can be used for other things. This is important because as far as the economic impact, you know very well, fire control is one of the major issues, and most of the budget, at least of the USDA, and I suspect also here in Canada, goes to fire control. And of course, if we remove the biomass, then there will be something to spend in what we do, right? So a major impact from the point of view of the economy. Now, if we take those chips from the live trees in top, L, to those that are on the field for 5 or 8 years, you can see the difference in their aspect. And if we do mechanical deconstruction and fibrillation, as we do here in Canada, and as we do here in the BPI, very strong in the area of mechanical pulping, TMP, CTMP pulping. If we do that by atmospheric mechanical fibrillator, then we get the fibers that you see on the right. What I want to tell here is that the chemical composition of the dead trees and the live trees is not too different. The aspect is quite different, and as I said before, the timber value maybe is lost. But when it goes to the production of fibers, you notice on the numbers that are on the far right, that the energy that is required to deconstruct and convert the wood into fibers is actually reduced in the case of the dead trees. So that's a plus. The energy that is required for fibrillation of the dead trees is lower. That makes a huge difference in the processing of this biomass. But what is more important is that that biomass then can be used, maybe not for construction. It's a residual material, low value as far as construction. But if we play with these processing techniques, similar to the mechanical refiner that I showed earlier, but in different scales, grinder, microfluidization, homogenization, these are tools that we use for fibrillating fibers to smaller sizes, then we can get a material that is quite competitive. And that has been shown earlier in efforts at pilot scales, creating films of cellulose fibrils or nanofibrils. There is an example of a roll-to-roll unit in BTT in Helsinki, where you take those fibrillated materials and you create paper-like non-wovens. And if you look at the properties, mechanical properties of such films, and if we compare those that are initially before refining of the dead and the live trees, and look at the film stress versus elongation, then initially they are relatively similar. Upon fibrillation, they then produce films that are stronger, higher stiffness, and if we compare the dead trees or those that come from dead trees or live trees, no major differences. So point here is that we're not losing anything when we take the whole wood, we fibrillate it to smaller scales, and then we reconstruct and re-engineer materials. That's the main pitch that I'm trying here to make at this point, right? There is value in that residue that we consider a waste, but it's not a waste. So with these fibers, of course, there are many possibilities. And here in wood science, we have Feng Xiang and also Emily Cranston. Thank you, Emily, for joining, who are making foams, and beetle kill fibers can be used for making foams for insulation. You are well aware of this. We play a little bit with the same idea that was in North Carolina when long time ago I was there. And what you see here is a system that takes those fibers, you put it in water, you add a surfactant, you make a foam, a wet foam, you replace 70% of the water in the slurry by air, so reduce the air consumption, and have a suspended medium that is a foam in these tanks that you can lay down into a running screen that becomes then a paper-like material. And if you dry in a clever way, that material can be a foam, a solid foam. So what I'm trying to say here is that this is possible, and it's a very nice example of what we can do. In a similar effort, not using beetle kill pine, but using regular fibers, actually since long ago, since 2 years ago, when I joined UBC also with my friend, Professor Johan Foster, we came with the idea of creating face masks to replace polypropylene face masks, right? That captured a lot of attention, and we promised actually to the Prime Minister of Canada that we were going to produce this in a commercial scale. That hasn't happened. It's difficult, but we have continued a little bit that process, and at some point last year, we ran also in BTT because we didn't have access to a system anywhere else, at least in the world, for this purpose. We ran in this paper machine foam material, suspending fibers to create the masks. And these are fiber-based masks. And at this point, there is a company that has sponsored this research. The point I'm making, an opportunity, huge opportunity to use fibers to create materials. And if we play with the technology like foam forming that I very briefly presented to you, then we get structures that are more like membranes where you can control the filtration and transport properties on those membranes. That means filtration. These filtration materials can be used, of course, in air filtration in buildings and many other applications, and also in foams for insulation. So huge opportunities if we think about waste fibers or residual fibers and proper technologies that can allow us to put things together, to re-engineer the material. So enough of fibers, residual fibers. Let me go now to agricultural, agri-forest waste. And this is an effort that we had with Chile, actually. Chile is a major producer of blueberries. Canada is also a major producer of blueberries, and Finns are very proud of the blueberries. Given the conditions in the northern region, during summer, they capture a lot of sunlight, and that makes some of the best antioxidants that are known, the blueberries from Finland. Big industry. Those blueberries are being used now as dye-sensitive solar cells because they are very effective for that purpose. But here we go in a different direction. We don't take the blueberries as such, we take the biomass that is left after pruning in those operations. This is in very high volume. That biomass you can convert into a biorefinery type of setup where you use a given fractionation solvents. Then you can produce platform chemicals like the ones that are cited on the far right. This is a possibility. It works. That's a biorefinery concept from the perspective of blueberry waste. The same applies to forest waste and forest fibers. But I will refer, maybe because of time, only to one example. And it's the idea of using this forest waste to convert it into materials. And in this case, we use ionic liquids to dissolve the whole biomass with no need to bleaching or separating components. I mentioned here ionic liquids because that has attracted a lot of attention recently. The next generation green solvents that are available today are quite different to those that were in the past. Major advances have been made in chemistry to come up with cheap ionic liquids that can be also recycled. And that was the subject of the Marcus Wallenberg Prize last year in Sweden, where a team of researchers in Finland won the prize because of the design of a proper ionic liquid and the use of the ionic liquids to produce textile filaments. Herbert Sista and Ilkka Kilpalainen in the University of Helsinki and Aalto University. So here we're doing something a little bit different, but related to ionic liquids. And I can talk in detail, but better to just look at the video and what we do. We take the whole biomass, we dissolve it in an ionic liquid, we extrude it because this will become sort of hydrogel that you can extrude, use syringe-like needle into a coagulation bath. That's what you see here in the bottom in the video. And then a filament will be formed. And that filament then is collected. And then now you have a material that is quite interesting. First, it contains all the components that are in the initial biomass. We're not extracting lignin, we're not extracting the phenols and tannins that are very rich in this biomass. Everything is together and is changed from a sort of tri-dimensional object biomass into a one-dimensional filament that can be used for textiles. And the beauty here is that an interesting development that is maybe on the side is that those filaments acquire water resistant, right? Cellulose is weak when exposed to water. When we separate cellulose, you can think about paper exposed to rain. But when it comes to these dopes that dissolve the whole biomass in the presence of the tannins and lignin, the material, when it's regenerated into a filament, is water resistant. And what better experiment than to put those filaments underwater for 9 months and check the resistance, right? So that's what we did in a collaboration with Colin Flanagan, that I will mention later, who is an advocate for coral reef restoration. And what we were doing here was to use those filaments to attach things and to replace the materials that are typically plastic-based. Okay, more closer to BC is the case of bark. I'm trying to show some ways of residual material that can be valorized. Bark is very important because of the composition. First, tannins, and also in some species, betulin. These are molecules that are either with a lot of aromatic groups or triterpene types of molecules. They are present in birch. In the case of cedar, they also are very rich in tannins. And both can really bring a lot of interesting properties. There is a lot of research. And I know the Forest Ministry is very interested to look into valorization of bark. And in our group, we're looking into extracting of these materials for applications like the ones that you see on the right, and with the residual fibers to create other materials. So that will be a story for a future opportunity. But I want to maybe emphasize here only because of time, a couple of examples of things that are very sexy that you can do with the tannins, right? More exotic, but connected to our environment. The first one is the use of plant tannin, especially tannic acids, in this case for separation of harmful molecules from water. So in this effort, this is a long story here, but I will summarize it for you. We take polyamide membranes that are used for water filtration, and we coat those membranes with the tannic acids that I have described so far. And what happens is that these tannic acids are very well known. The word tannin also reflects that. They bind molecules very strongly, especially proteins, right? Tannic acids are very strongly bind to proteins, and that's part of the leather industry, right? But not only the proteins that we find in leather, many other proteins and biomacromolecules that are not as nice as you may think, and that will be antibiotics. Major issue in water streams, antibiotic contamination is huge in human health. The concentrations are very, very small, in some cases not detectable. Regulation is very difficult, and there is a problem of antibiotics. So what if we take tannins from bark, we put them in membranes, and we separate antibiotics? Under the principle is that the tannin is a very good to complex with proteins and many other molecules. And the story is that, yeah, well, it worked very well. There is an explanation here that I skipped. You can refer to the publication, but it was tested in poultry farms and livestock farms to look into the removal of antibiotics that are extensively used in nurturing, for instance, here at chicken and livestock. Major problem, actually. And what we found is that those tannins that are so simple and so available and relatively cheap can compete against materials that are quite exotic from the point of view of engineering, those that are based on reticular chemistry, like metal organic frameworks that are used for CO2 capture, relatively expensive, even though some may contradict and say, no, there are now next generation metal organic frameworks that are inexpensive, and many other materials, including carbon nanotubes and other. Huge opportunity for tannic acid from bark. In a second example related to the same, given the amazing capacity of tannic acids from bark to complex, to attach biomolecules, we look into microplastic removal, actually. And this is not yet published, it's going to be published, but the idea here is to take sawdust, impregnate sawdust with tannic acids, add a metal counteragent, and to have a system in a packed column that you can flow water containing microplastics, and then for the microplastics to be separated by the material. And that was tested actually for different types of microplastics. You can see here a list. I won't entertain you with those names here, but you can recognize very prevalent microplastics in the ocean and water streams. And regardless the size of those materials, those microplastics, very good removal performance due to the tannin material that is in the composition. Okay, so valorization of biomass, that's the future, right? I hope you agree with me. One more example about biomass valorization, especially from the point of view of wood residues in construction that I promised I was going to talk. Major issue. Think about this. In the US, the municipal wood waste is shown here versus number of years. You can see the huge volume mass that is generated in the millions of tons and how much of this is recycled. Very little. Huge opportunity for us working in this area to reuse wood. And the question is how to do that. Of course, you can do it directly, wood to wood. That's perfectly fine. Probably that's the best. But there are residues that are a little bit challenging, like the ones that you see here, decayed wood. I would include here also sawdust or waste wood that is a multi-component mixture that will be difficult to repurpose, right? So looking into how to play with the so-called interfacial chemistry, we propose a very simple process that actually is grabbing a lot of attention, especially in the Nordic countries, for other uses of this idea of cellulose regeneration. I will make this very simple, but I acknowledge we haven't looked into the life cycle assessment nor the economics. That needs to be done. But at least from the principle of work, what we did was to take the wood that is fractionated, any of those. We did partial delignification, remove lignin from that wasted wood, from those pieces of wood. And then we partially dissolve the cellulose that is inside wood. And when I say partially dissolve is we take the fibers in wood that are in situ there, and we dissolve only the surface of the fibers, exposing the critical microcomponents that are formed in the cell wall, the microfibers that you know exist. And that process leads to cellulose that is dissolved, but is not going to be removed. It stays there. Having this material and subjecting the material to water and drying, then that dissolved cellulose that is at the interface regenerates the same way we regenerate cellulose to make textiles. Same process, but here using wood in such a way that you heal the wood material. The fractionated wood now is becoming a single unit, monolithic unit that recovers the properties. That's shown here, just as an example, as an illustration, pieces of wood that then become a single material by this simple process. And what is interesting is that healed wood, if you look at in the lab at the mechanical properties, specific strength, compared to many other types of wood, they are really competitive. Actually, you can regenerate the material, recirculate the material, and gain in strength. That's the holy grail in textile recycling and wood recycling. Can we recycle the material without losing the properties and even increasing the properties? There are many ways to do this. And in this case, we showed that this is possible, right? Okay, in the last section, I think I will have 10 minutes, right? I have, what, 45 minutes? Okay. In this last part, I will talk a little bit about recirculation, not of the biomass as a whole, but paper and textiles. I think this is very critical for many, many reasons. First example, also 3 years ago when I joined UBC, a company came to us with a problem that is quite interesting and you will recognize. The textiles that we use undergoes a number of multi-step processes, many of them in many different places around the globe. There is no more unsustainable contaminant process than the generation of textiles. And This person that came to the group is a former designer for Veravan company, that is a high fashion company. And she had in her mind the principle that this process should be eliminated and we should go to a single step process. She came with a problem and we helped to solve that problem. What she proposed was to take fibers, like wood fibers, like what we find in paper, and to, by one direct route of manufacturing, produce the textile. This, in other words, is make paper, but paper that is same as a textile material as far as its behavior. So we tested that using similar concepts as the one that I showed earlier for wood. I don't give details, but one of those is partial dissolution and regeneration. And that allows them in one step to produce materials. And of course, the best way to attract investors is to show prototypes. And these are the prototypes that were produced here. This is a shoe top because everybody loves shoes, right? So shoe top that has a given texture on the surface. It has a sole that is 3D printed, but this material is just paper. The difference is that this material is super strong. You can put in the washing machine and wash your shoes, and it's not going to break apart because a simple modification, right? It's not a woven material. It's not the typical woven textile. It's a non-woven textile similar than paper. Talking about the same, I want to bring back the ionic liquids as green solvents. I'm not a chemist, but those of you who have a better flavor for chemistry, you can recognize the different types of ionic liquids that are available. The next generation, new generation of protic ionic liquids have been tested very nicely to create dopes based on wood, based on paper, and based also on regular bleach fibers. And that was the Wallenberg Prize last year, right? That I mentioned earlier. The idea here is to take wood pulp or textile or waste, perform dissolution with ionic liquids, and do the typical process that is well known in fiber extrusion or dry jet wet spinning to produce fabrics, to produce fibers or yarns for fabrics. And that process works very well. So here the experience in Aalto University, where I was before, has been quite successful. Think about the investment of the university in this startup, IonCell. The university invested there 7 million euros to have a machinery to process biomass into textiles and to recover the ionic liquid. That was the difficult part. And now it's possible to do. They are still in the starting point, but many companies in Finland are in this same game, using ionic liquids and other solvents to produce textiles from wood. What is unique in the ionic liquid is that you can use actually waste paper to go into that process, and these fibers that you see, these yarns that you see there is from waste paper. So I think, of course, there is a lot here to be said about this process. Okay, I show one last example of what is possible in the area of spinning, and for that matter, textile recycling. Think about H&M company, very large Swedish company. They use a lot of fossil carbon in creating the textiles. And they also use cellulose-based textiles. But the environmental unit in H&M has a mission by 2030 to use all recycled feedstock in the production of textiles. As H&M, all textiles are in the same boat, looking into recirculating, recycling textiles in their process. Very important. And that will involve also cellulose beyond plastics, right? Let me talk about the case of cellulose and show you a little bit of a very recent work in this area. Cellulose can be dissolved with cheaper solvents compared to the exotic ionic liquids that I introduced before. If you take sodium hydroxide, alkali solution, it's possible to dissolve cellulose. In fact, the process requires low temperature dissolution. That's well known. The problem is that sodium hydroxide hasn't been too effective to be used in filament spinning. And the reason is shown here. If you dissolve the cellulose fibers, wood fibers, in alkali solution, if you have airtight material, it will flow very nicely. That's what you want if you want to spin the material. If you want to extrude in a needle to produce a filament, that's what you want, something with low viscosity. The problem is the observation that if you have the material open to the air, it will become very jelly. It's not going to flow. And that has prevented the use of cellulosic fibers in the production with no bleaching, or for instance, not as demanding. Here we use just sodium hydroxide solution. That has prevented the use of cellulose in the production of textiles because the material becomes very viscous, it gels, and then it's difficult to push. You cannot go beyond 6% cellulose concentration for producing textile from sodium hydroxide. We want to push that limit and go to 12% cellulose dissolution, but keeping the viscosity low. How to do that? So the thing here, the observation made in Chalmers University in parallel by us, super simple, and that tells a little bit about, the mystery of research. Simply having this not exposed to air will keep the material easy to flow. The reason is that air contains CO2. The CO2 is absorbed by the alkali solution, and it will gel the cellulose. It's an early gelation that you want to prevent. That's it, as simple as that. So what we did was exactly that. We took cellulose, sodium hydroxide. Here I show the way that we do to keep this airtight. We mix zinc oxide, low temperature, then freeze in a lower temperature, and you have a material that is very easy to spin into textiles. This is the best process possible that you can think. So we published that, and what we found here is that regulating the access to CO2 in the atmosphere by the cellulose dissolution, you can create a number of materials. And I have no time to explain all the details, but this is a nice illustration that Juan Carlos is a student in the group put together. I love this illustration. The idea here is that you can have low cellulose concentration in the alkali solution or high cellulose concentration. You can have an open atmosphere or an airtight atmosphere. And depending where you stand in those quadrants, you can regulate the gelation of the material and the properties of the dope. If we stand in this area, we can do filament spinning or 3D printing. If you go on this area, then you can look into additives to concrete. The beautiful aspect here is that when you have high CO2 absorption, the CO2 is absorbed in the cellulose dissolution, form minerals. Those minerals combine with cellulose and create super strong materials. Beautiful. And that's what we show here in the case of concretes and ceramic glazes. So not to go into details, low cellulose concentration, high CO2 absorption or mineralization. That's what you see, carbonates and different forms of minerals that are combined with cellulose, and then they can be used in ceramics and concrete. Very strong materials. Or if we go in the other area to 3D printing, then we have airtight atmosphere, so easy to flow, easy to extrude, but we have low CO2 absorption. This is how the dope look. You have cellulose, and this is very good for 3D printing. Or, I just skip this, or to create molds like I show here that are quite interesting as a side project, looking into coral reef growth that I indicated earlier. Typically, we use ceramic plugs to seed this for coral reef to grow. These are the different species. This is work with California, with an ocean institute. And what we tried here was to use these molds based on cellulose to produce this and to find that the material grows perfectly fine, better than the conventional ceramic plugs that are used. And this is being tested actually. So it's a side project to show the possibilities that exist in this area. Or as you saw before, if we want to do filament spinning, yes, then we do filament spinning. You see that here. And in this process where we collect the filaments, and those filaments, if we put them in a plot of a specific strength of the filament and the modulus, then you can see those materials competing quite close with some fibers, engineered fibers, as well as ion cell that I mentioned earlier. So a lot of opportunities. Okay, the last one to keep time for questions is the idea of then materials that are further wasted that cannot be used in any of these can be used for pellets and microfibrillated cellulose. Pellets, you know very well. Those residual materials that may have no use in other processes can go as energy pellets. We have collaboration here with Wood Science in this area. And with the possibility to produce fibrillated cellulose or nanocelluloses, UBC is one of the strongest in this area. We have a critical mass of faculty and researchers that are very active in the area of nanocellulose, and there is an opportunity here for UBC to put the flag in this area. In the fibrillation process, you know very well that we take fibers and we deconstruct the fibers into smaller sizes, into nano, micro scale. And what, of course, you know we're doing here, and this is the last part that I don't mention, but this is the focus of our research, in fact, is to re-engineer, repurpose those fibers that are extracted from plants and residues to create the materials of the future, to reassemble those into construction and structural materials or biomedical materials. And that's what the Forest Ministry wants. Now, how to propel that, how to incentivize that, I don't know. But we need to change our mindset and think about long-term research to really compete against the giants that we find, especially in the Nordic countries. They are well ahead of us in this area. As far as the translation, knowledge translation, companies are well invested in the process of innovation with the government and with the research centers are putting out a lot of materials based on wood. Anyway, that's all. This is the last slide to recognize the challenges, diversity of building blocks, the full use of resources, the need for us to go for high yield processes and reduce water in all the processes, because water is our vehicle for transformation, and also to use the power of biology. I don't talk about that, but there is a lot of work in this area, of course. So the way forward is residues to these materials of the future. This is my last slide, acknowledgement to our research group. They are the ones doing the work. I'm just an ambassador to what they do, really. And all the funding agencies. And of course, I would like also to thank you for your attention and for coming today. So this is great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Orlando. That was excellent. We have time for a few questions. Are there any questions? Yes, Sean.
Sean, you always ask difficult questions. Let's see what you come. That's for the Zoom. We're hybrid.
I have a bunch of questions, but I'm not going to ask you a bunch. But, I was interested about two things, I guess, right off the bat. So you talk about extracting tannic acids from bark, for example, or you could go for a bunch of different plant materials, but most of the time they're in condensed tannins. So how do you get the tannic acid from them? Because it's not coming out in high concentrations as tannic acid. So that first question.
Yeah, we use tannic acid. That's the short question. And of course, that requires hydrolysis.
Right. So now you're adding a step, a processing step to it.
It's not too bad. It's just hydrolysis, right?
Oh,
But
okay.
you're right.
So, all right. And now we're going to go to the example you gave about the blueberries, which I find really interesting. But in your diagram, you showed pyrolysis, gamma varolactone.
In the top.
Yeah. And then pyrolysis again to get to all of your fractionation.
Yeah.
There's no way that can be cost effective.
No, that's why I didn't discuss it.
I see.
So, yeah. So, but that's a possibility under the concept of the biorefinery. If you are able to recycle the solvents, in that case, ionic liquids, things become a little bit more attractive. So I think there is still a possibility there. But this is the idea of reducing wood, the biomass, to chemicals. In our group, in our colleagues group, we tend not to go in that direction. We don't deconstruct wood into molecules. We prefer to stop at some point into fibrillated cellulose.
Yes.
That's my preference.
So, but I looked at that and I was going to ask you, so my follow-up to that question is, instead of pyrolysis, gamma varolactone, pyrolysis, why not try something like hydrogenation?
Yeah, why not?
Because you would recover your fibers and you would have your soluble phenolics afterwards.
Yes. Yeah, that's alternative. This is just one.
Okay.
Based on the ionic liquid-based biorefinery. But for sure, there are many other ways. But now, if you think about that, that's a biorefinery, what you're saying, right? Biorefineries are around. A pulp and paper mill is a biorefinery. But just looking at the material itself and pulp and paper production, if you think about investments that are happening now in Sweden and especially Finland, and Äänekoski biorefinery, you start to see all of these all connected. Using wood to produce pulp and paper, so sawmills integrated, and then also the different directions to produce other materials, including tannins and others. But that hasn't advanced too much. It's so far, some fractions of given target molecules. Tall oil is one of those. But there is much that is needed to progress in this direction. And this is the audience that will do that. It's the researchers and the students in forest science, right?
Hi, thanks very much for your presentation. It never fails to amaze me how many different types of things that can be derived from wood products. I'm coming more from the forest management, forest operations side of things. And, one of the missing gaps that I can't seem to find anywhere, and I don't know if you can shed any light on, is a question around scaling and how much fiber, how much residue will translate into an amount of like unit amount to unit amount and some values attached to that. So you need X number of fiber of, I'm sorry, I've forgotten all the chemical names. Yeah. I'm not a chemist, but you need X amount of a certain type of chemical. What does that translate to in wood waste? Because then that would really help me in determining, what volumes of wood need to come from how many kilometers away, because that's where my area of expertise lies.
So Tannins can tell, and the students here can tell, the major thing that prevents the use of residues from the forest is the location and transportation. That's the big player there, costs, major issue, major challenge, access and transportation costs. As far as what you can do, if you think about all the residues, this is an amazing volume of materials that we can use. So I think there is an opportunity to have a market pool as far as those materials. It's just like the, how we call it, supply chain. It's not really in place, right? And here we need to solve a problem that I see in Canada. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you can educate me in this. The triple helix is failing in this area. The research centers, the industry, and the government are working in silos. I don't see the connections that I see in other places. In Canada, we have an amazing opportunity with the National Research Canada, across Canada, the many research institutions working in this area, and the government to really make an impact. The problem is that we don't see the funnel of innovation and translation working, separated. Everybody pulling in different directions. To add to that is the forest access, right? And the discussion of forest management, that's critical. This is not my area, but I'm learning from professors like Dominic here that really are on top of this. And I know we need to solve that puzzle. But what I learned from what he's saying, and Dominic is not here, so I'm talking on his behalf, but what I understand is that really we need to use more the residues that exist in the forest, right? But of course, there are a number of challenges. Maybe I didn't answer completely your question, but
no, I agree entirely with what you're saying, and access is a clear issue. But access is really, any kind of access is possible. It depends on how much can you pay for it, right? Like right now, the maximum radius around a processing center for most residuals, give or take, is 50 kilometers. And if you have a higher value product and it is,
yes,
this much,
yes,
well, how much of residuals will produce this much,
yes,
chemical, and how much is that worth? If we have a handle on that number, then we know how much we need to invest in, yes, infrastructure.
Yeah, I don't have obviously that number, but
no.
one thing I can tell, using residues to produce paper, I mean, it's not economically viable. But residuals to produce, let's say, cell culturing hydrogels of cellulose, that can be super attractive, and transportation is not an issue anymore. Think about UPM, one of the largest forest companies in Finland. They started a department or a unit that is called UPM Biomedicals. They are producing hydrogels based on cellulose, and I don't know what the number is. Maybe I'm mistaken. I don't want to quote, but something like this. 1 liter of this is going to be 30,000 euros. Why? Because this goes to cell growth and tissue engineering. You see the point, right?
Oh, I totally see the point.
The key here is to access biomass to create materials that are value added. And that goes beyond paper. But we still stay in pellets. We still stay in timber, which is perfectly good. I'm happy with that. That's very good. But there is a possibility here to open the landscape to residues, to value-added materials. Forest Ministry recognizes that. But still, we need to work in combination, not in silos. And that's the problem, I think.
Thank you.
And maybe I'm very simplistic and ignorant, so apologize if but I think in general, we can agree on some of this, right? At least.
The key is to make sure the product doesn't saturate the market regarding the price, right? So here's an example, like the old Bellingham mill that used to produce 90% of the world's vanillin, right? One mill produced 90% of the world's vanillin, right? So it's a great product, but if you saturate the market, then it's not.
Yeah.
So
Well, think about textiles. The demand of cellulose for textile is growing and continuously growing. Textile is a priority. There are mills like Cellulose Arauco in Chile. Most of their pulp or the fibers go to dissolving gray cellulose in Asia to create textiles. There is not enough cellulose to cover all the textile needs. That's an example where there is a major need. The problem here is that dimension, the economics and the supply chain that you know better. The other aspect is, climate change. And what we see now in many of these companies is that they are having huge problems with, of course, forest fires, drought, no water, and besides many other elements. But this is really worrisome, right? So we need to think about, forest management, genetic engineering, all of this combined, right? I mean, this is part of what we do here in Wood Science, right? A lot of pressure. And at the end, I think we need to think holistically about the full utilization of the fiber resource. And that includes not forests. I have tried to make the case, as my colleagues here in NC State, to look into agricultural residues. In Canada, very important, wheat straw, hemp fibers, and others, right?